The afternoon Daniel's dog escaped through the fence for the third time in 2 weeks. He realized that the loneliest part of living alone wasn't the silence. It was pretending the silence didn't bother him. Daniel Carter was 41, a freelance illustrator who worked from a converted garage behind a small rental house in suburban Oregon, and he had been quietly stagnant for about 2 years, ever since his ex-fiancée decided that creative stability wasn't the same thing as actual stability and left for someone whose job title didn't require explanation at dinner parties. He wasn't bitter, just tired, and he had adopted a 3-year-old golden retriever named Copper from a shelter 6 months ago, mostly because the house felt too big for one person, and the dog didn't care what Daniel did for a living. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October when Copper squeezed through a gap in the back fence that Daniel had been meaning to fix for weeks. Daniel was halfway through sketching a book cover illustration, headphones on, coffee going cold on the workbench, when he heard the knock at the front door. He pulled the headphones off and opened the door to find a woman standing on his porch holding Copper by the collar. She was maybe 37, brown hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing paint-stained jeans and an oversized gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Copper was wagging his tail like he'd just made a new best friend. She looked at Daniel, then at the dog, then back at Daniel and said, "He's not the only one who keeps coming here." Daniel blinked. She smiled not unkindly and added, "I'm Rachel. I live behind you. This is the 3rd time this week I've found him in my yard." Daniel felt his face warm. "I'm so sorry. I keep meaning to fix the fence." She let go of Copper's collar, and the dog immediately trotted inside like nothing had happened. Rachel stayed on the porch, hands in her pockets. "He's sweet. Doesn't bark? Just sits by my back door like he's waiting for someone." She paused. "I figured I should bring him back before he decided to move in permanently." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I really do appreciate it. I'll get that fence fixed this weekend." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "You said that last weekend when I brought him back." She wasn't scolding him, just stating a fact. Daniel laughed, embarrassed. "You're right. I did." She studied him for a second, then said, "If you need help with it, I've got tools. I'm not great with dogs, but I'm decent with wood and wire." He wasn't sure if she was being neighborly or if she just wanted the problem solved. Either way, he said, "I wouldn't want to bother you." She shrugged. "You're already bothering me. Might as well make it productive?" That was how Daniel ended up in his backyard 20 minutes later with Rachel crouched next to the broken fence section, pulling away loose boards while Copper watched from the patio. She worked quickly, no wasted movement, and she didn't fill the silence with small talk. Daniel held the new board steady while she drilled in screws, and the only sound between them was the hum of the drill and the occasional instruction. When they finished, she stood up, brushed sawdust off her jeans, and said, "That should hold him unless he's learning to climb." Daniel looked at the fence, then at her. "Thank you. Seriously. I owe you." Rachel wiped her hands on a rag she'd brought from her side of the yard. "You don't owe me anything. Just keep him on your side and we're even." She started to leave, then stopped and turned back. "Actually, if you're any good with design, I might take you up on that." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Design?" She nodded toward her house. "I run a small pottery studio out of my place. I've been trying to make flyers for a holiday market, but everything I come up with looks like a middle school art project." He almost laughed. "I do book covers, but I can probably help with a flyer." She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Good. I'll bring you the details tomorrow." Then she climbed back through the gap in the hedges between their yards and disappeared. The next afternoon, Rachel showed up at his front door again, this time with a notebook, a coffee mug from her studio, and a rough sketch that did in fact look like a middle school art project. She sat at his kitchen table while Daniel pulled up his design software and asked her questions about the market, the vibe she wanted, the kind of people who bought her work. She answered with the same directness she'd used while fixing the fence, no filler, just information. Her pottery was minimalist, she said, mostly bowls and mugs in soft grays and blues, nothing flashy. The market was downtown, first weekend in December, and she needed something clean that didn't look like she was trying too hard. Daniel worked while she sipped her coffee and watched. After about 30 minutes, he turned the screen toward her. She leaned forward, studied the mock-up, and said, "That's perfect. How much do I owe you?" He shook his head. "You fixed my fence. Call it even." She looked at him like she was deciding whether to argue, then said, "Fine. But if Copper gets out again, I'm charging you." He grinned. "Deal." She didn't leave right away. Instead, she asked about the illustrations pinned to the wall above his desk, and he explained that most of them were covers for romance novels and literary fiction. She picked up one of the prints, a watercolor forest scene with a figure barely visible between the trees, and said, "This one's sad." He looked at it. "It's supposed to be hopeful." She set it down carefully. "It's both." Then she asked, "Do you like what you do?" The question surprised him. Most people asked if he made good money or how he got into it, not whether he actually liked it. He thought about it, then said, "Most days. It's quiet work. I get to stay home. I don't have to explain myself to anyone." She nodded slowly. That sounds lonely. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he said nothing. She stood up, thanked him again for the flyer, and left. Over the next 2 weeks, Rachel started showing up more often. Sometimes she brought Copper back after he'd squeezed through a section of fence they'd missed. Sometimes she knocked to borrow a ladder or to ask if Daniel had seen her mail get delivered to his box by mistake. Once, she showed up with a mug she'd made, pale blue with a thin dark rim, and handed it to him without explanation. "You keep using the same chipped one," she said. It was starting to depress me. He looked down at the mug in his hands, then at her. "Thank you." She shrugged. "It's just a mug." But it wasn't just a mug, and Daniel knew it, and he was pretty sure she knew it too. The spaces between her visits started to feel longer than they actually were. He found himself listening for her knock or for Copper's bark that meant he'd found another gap in the fence. One evening in mid-November, she texted him, a number she'd saved after the flyer project, and asked if he knew anything about fixing a leaking pipe under a kitchen sink. He texted back that he knew a little, and she replied, "Good enough. Come over if you're free." Her place was smaller than his, a cottage-style house with a pottery wheel set up in what used to be a dining room and shelves of finished work lining the walls. The kitchen smelled like wet wood and soap. She was on her knees under the sink with a wrench, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, and she looked up when he came in. "I can't get this fitting to stop dripping." He crouched down next to her, took the wrench, and tightened the connection until the drip stopped. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath. "You just saved me from calling a plumber on a Saturday night." He wiped his hands on a rag she handed him. "Glad I could help." She stood up, filled 2 glasses with water, and handed him one. They sat at her kitchen table, which was covered in sketches and clay samples. She asked how his work was going, and he told her about a cover he was struggling with, trying to capture loneliness without making it look heavy-handed. She listened, really listened, and then said, "Loneliness isn't heavy. It's light. It's the absence of weight. That's what makes it hard to show." He stared at her. She took a sip of water. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. That's just really accurate." She smiled, but it was softer this time, almost tentative. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Are you always this careful?" He frowned. "Careful how?" She set her glass down. "Around people. You're polite. You show up when I ask. You fix things, but you never stay longer than you need to. It's like you're worried about taking up space." He looked at the table, at the clay dust smudged across the wood. "I guess I got used to not being wanted around." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "For the record, I wouldn't ask if I didn't want you here." The air in the room changed. Daniel looked up and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. She didn't look away. He said, "I didn't know that." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed loosely. "Well, now you do." He wanted to say something else, something better, but his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, saw his brother's name, and ignored it. Rachel noticed. "You can take that if you need to." He shook his head. "It's fine." She studied him, then said, "You're doing it again." He smiled despite himself. "Doing what?" She stood up and walked to the sink, rinsed her glass. "Being careful." He stood too, suddenly aware of how close the kitchen felt. "I'm not trying to be difficult." She turned around, leaning against the counter. "I didn't say difficult. I said careful." She paused. "There's a difference." He took a step closer without meaning to. "What if I don't know how to be anything else?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Then I guess we'll figure it out together." The week before Thanksgiving, Daniel's ex-fiancée, Lauren, called him out of nowhere and asked if they could meet for coffee. He said yes before he thought about it, mostly because he'd spent 2 years wondering if there was something he should have said or done differently, and he still didn't have an answer. They met at a place downtown that used to be their spot, back when things were good. Lauren looked exactly the same, polished and sharp, and she smiled when he sat down like no time had passed. She asked about his work, his life, whether he was seeing anyone. He kept his answers short. She talked about her new job, her new apartment, her new boyfriend who worked in finance and traveled a lot. Then she said, "I've been thinking about you." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She leaned forward. "I think I made a mistake, Daniel. I think I gave up on us too soon." He felt something tighten in his chest, but it wasn't hope. It was something closer to anger. "You didn't give up too soon, Lauren. You left because I wasn't what you wanted." She shook her head. "I was scared. I didn't know what I wanted." He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that he didn't feel anything. No hurt, no longing, nothing. "You knew exactly what you wanted. You just didn't want me." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "That's not fair." He pulled his hand back. "It's accurate." She sat back, surprised. "You're different." He stood up, put money on the table for his coffee. "No, Lauren. I'm just done being careful around people who already decided I wasn't enough." He walked out before she could respond. When he got home, Rachel was sitting on his front porch with Copper, who had apparently escaped again. She looked up when Daniel walked over and her expression shifted. "Are you okay?" He sat down next to her, suddenly exhausted. I just had coffee with my ex. Rachel didn't ask for details. She just said, "How'd it go?" He laughed, short and bitter. "She told me she made a mistake leaving me. I told her she didn't." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good." He looked at her. "Good?" She nodded. "Yeah, good. Because if you'd gone back to her, I would have had to fix your fence alone, and I'm running out of screws." He stared at her, and then he started laughing. Real laughter this time, and she smiled. She nudged his shoulder with hers. "Come on. Let's get Copper inside before he decides to move in with me permanently." They stood up, and as they walked toward the door, she said, "For what it's worth, I think you're more than enough." He stopped. She stopped, too, turned to face him. He said, "Rachel!" She said, "Yeah?" He didn't plan it. He just leaned in and kissed her, soft and careful, and she didn't pull away. When he stepped back, she was smiling. "Took you long enough." 3 months later, on a cold afternoon in February, Daniel was working in his garage studio when Rachel knocked and let herself in. She set a box on his workbench, filled with mugs and bowls wrapped in newspaper. "I'm moving my studio," she said. He looked up. "Where?" She smiled. "Here, if that's okay." He stood up. "Here as in my garage?" She shook her head. "Here as in our garage." He stared at her. She stepped closer. "I'm tired of living next door, Daniel. I want to wake up in the same house." He didn't say anything for a second, and then he pulled her into a hug. She laughed against his shoulder. "Is that a yes?" He kissed the top of her head. "That's a yes." 6 months after that, on a quiet Sunday morning in August, Daniel asked Rachel to marry him in the backyard they'd fixed together, with Copper lying in the grass nearby. She said yes before he even finished the question. They got married in the same spot 3 months later, just the two of them and a handful of friends. And when the officiant asked if they had vows, Rachel said, "He already knows." Daniel smiled because she was right. He did. The afternoon Daniel's dog escaped through the fence for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. He had no idea that within a year, his entire life would look completely different. But that's the thing about loneliness. It's not a permanent condition. It's just the space before someone knocks on your door and refuses to let you stay careful forever. So here's the question. What would you have done if your neighbor kept showing up with your dog and instead of just fixing the fence, she fixed everything? And have you ever met someone who saw through your walls before you even knew you'd built them? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.